June 22nd, 1940, a date that would haunt France for generations. Inside a railway carriage sitting in the quiet forest of Compiègne, the very same carriage where Germany had signed its humiliating surrender back in 1918, French officials now put their signatures on an armistice agreement with Nazi Germany, officially ending the fighting. Just 6 brutal weeks of combat had cost the lives of 90,000 French soldiers and 60,000 innocent French civilians caught in the crossfire. More than 10 million terrified people had fled southward in the largest mass exodus of refugees Europe had ever witnessed, clogging every road with desperate families carrying whatever they could save. Now, finally, it was over. France, once considered one of the world's great military powers, had surrendered to Hitler's Germany. But across the narrow waters of the English Channel, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before microphones and declared something that shocked the world. Britain would fight on completely alone against the Nazi war machine. In the streets of Paris, now filled with German troops marching past the Arc de Triomphe, in the small villages of Normandy still smoking from recent bombardment, and in the crowded southern zone where refugees were packed into every available space, ordinary French civilians heard this astonishing news and reacted in ways that might genuinely surprise you today. Their responses, preserved in diaries and letters and interviews, reveal something deeply profound about what defeat truly means, about where hope comes from in dark times, and about what it feels like to watch your own country fall apart while your closest ally refuses to give up the fight. The reactions split along unexpected lines that nobody could have predicted. Simone de Beauvoir, a 32-year-old writer who would later become famous as a philosopher, sat in a Parisian café now frequently visited by German officers in their crisp uniforms. She wrote honestly in her private diary that she felt a strange kind of shameful relief when the armistice was signed. At least the killing had finally stopped. At least her friends would stop dying on battlefields. But when she heard the news that Britain absolutely refused to surrender, that Churchill was vowing to fight on no matter what, she wrote something else that revealed her deep doubt and exhaustion. "The English are completely mad," she wrote. "They'll be invaded within weeks by German forces. And then what exactly was the point of any of this suffering?" She wasn't alone in this weary, defeated view of Britain's decision. Across the occupied city of Paris, across all of occupied France, really, many ordinary people shared her bone-deep exhaustion and skepticism. They had watched in horror as their supposedly mighty army collapsed in just 6 weeks of fighting. They had seen the roads completely clogged with terrified refugees fleeing the advancing Germans, had heard the terrifying sound of German dive bombers screaming down from the sky, had watched German tanks rolling past monuments and buildings that were supposed to stand eternal and unchanging. The idea that Britain, with its small army barely evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk and stripped of all its heavy equipment and weapons, could somehow manage to defeat the apparently unstoppable German military machine seemed like pure fantasy, like wishful thinking disconnected from reality. An unnamed woman living in the city of Lyon, her identity lost to history, but her powerful words preserved in a letter she sent to her sister living safely in America, wrote with bitter anger, "The British soldiers ran away at Dunkirk and abandoned us to face the Germans completely alone. And now they have the nerve to say they'll keep fighting from the safety of their island. So let them fight if they want, because we French have had more than enough of this terrible war." This anger directed at Britain was genuine and surprisingly widespread among French civilians. The British Expeditionary Force had managed to evacuate an impressive 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk, including 123,000 French troops rescued alongside their British allies. But they had been forced to leave behind absolutely all their heavy equipment, all their tanks and artillery and vehicles. From the French perspective, they had left France to continue fighting the Germans without them, without British support. And now, From what seemed like the comfortable safety of their island protected by the English Channel, the British were calling France's decision to surrender shameful and cowardly. In the busy cafés of Marseille, in the temporary capital city of Vichy, where Marshal Pétain's brand-new government was just forming to run unoccupied France, people repeated a bitter joke that captured their resentment. The British, they said with dark humor, will gladly fight to the very last French soldier. But if you walked into different neighborhoods, if you talked to different kinds of people in different situations, you heard something completely different, something that showed how divided France truly was. In a small fishing village in the Brittany region, a weathered fisherman named Jean-Marie Corvella stood alone on the beach staring across the Channel waters toward England in the distance. He was 41 years old, too old to be drafted into the army, but both of his sons had been captured during the fighting, and he didn't know if they were even still alive or if they'd been killed. When he heard the news that Churchill had publicly vowed to keep fighting no matter what happened, he felt something completely unexpected rising in his chest. He felt hope, actual genuine hope for the first time in weeks. He turned to his worried wife and said something simple but powerful. "If the English keep fighting," he told her quietly, "then this war isn't truly over yet. And then maybe, just maybe, our boys will eventually come home to us." In the unoccupied southern zone, in towns and villages scattered across southern France, where Vichy now ruled, many ordinary people saw Britain's absolute defiance not as foolishness or madness, but as genuine courage, as an inspiration. A schoolteacher in Toulouse wrote thoughtfully in her diary, "Marshal Pétain keeps telling us we must accept our defeat with dignity and grace, but the English have refused to accept defeat at all. They've said no to Hitler's demands." And I find myself wondering which response is truly more dignified. The class divisions in French society mattered enormously in shaping these different reactions. The bourgeoisie, the property-owning middle and upper classes, the long-established families with something to lose, they overwhelmingly tended to support Pétain's armistice agreement. They had watched their orderly world turned completely upside down by the chaos of war and defeat. The armistice promised them stability, order, security, a return to traditional French values they treasured. Marshal Pétain's speeches about the importance of work, family, and fatherland resonated deeply with their conservative values. Britain's stubborn determination to fight on threatened to prolong the chaos and uncertainty they desperately wanted to end. But among factory workers, among left-leaning politically active citizens, among those who had always been naturally suspicious of the establishment and the wealthy elite, Britain's decision to fight on sparked something quite different in their hearts. A factory worker in the industrial city of Saint-Étienne said bluntly to his fellow workers on the factory floor, "The rich people have already made their comfortable peace with the Germans, but the English workers are still out there fighting. So maybe this war isn't actually over after all. Maybe there's still a chance." The regional differences across France were stark and dramatic. In the occupied northern zone, where German soldiers patrolled every street in their uniforms and German regulations controlled every aspect of daily life, speaking openly about supporting Britain was genuinely dangerous, potentially deadly. People kept their true thoughts locked inside themselves. They listened secretly to BBC radio broadcasts transmitted from London, turning the volume down low, drawing the curtains so neighbors couldn't see the telltale glow of the radio dial. When they heard the BBC's French-language service reporting on British determination and small victories, some listeners felt a spark of something they thought they had lost forever: hope. Others remained convinced the BBC was lying, that it was all propaganda, that Britain would surrender within weeks just like France had. In the unoccupied southern zone under Vichy control, there was somewhat more freedom to speak your mind, but the official government line was crystal clear and enforced. Pétain's Vichy government actively blamed Britain for France's military defeat. The newspapers, now tightly controlled by Vichy censors, printed article after article criticizing British abandonment of France in her hour of need. They confidently predicted Germany would invade and conquer Britain within just 1 month. They suggested repeatedly that France was actually better off having made peace with Germany. Many French civilians believed this official narrative completely. A merchant living in Vichy itself wrote to his brother, "Marshal Pétain has saved France from total destruction. The Marshal knows exactly what he's doing. The English are being stubborn and foolish. And when they're invaded soon, they'll desperately wish they'd made peace like we wisely did." But other French citizens read between the lines and noticed something interesting. A librarian in Clermont-Ferrand observed something that made her suspicious. The Vichy newspapers spend an awful lot of time and energy insisting that Britain will definitely be defeated very soon. And she told her husband quietly, if they were really confident about that, they wouldn't need to say it so often and so loudly. Then came July 3rd, 1940, and everything changed dramatically. The British Royal Navy launched a surprise attack on the French fleet, anchored at Mers el-Kébir in Algeria. The British feared desperately that these powerful French warships would somehow fall into German hands and be used against Britain. The French admiral commanding the fleet firmly refused to surrender his ships or sail them to British-controlled ports. The British, feeling they had no choice, opened fire with their big guns. 1,297 French sailors, men who had recently been allies, died in the attack. The shocking news exploded across France like a bomb. In Paris, in Lyon, in Marseille, in small villages across both the occupied and unoccupied zones, French civilians reacted with genuine shock and burning fury. Even those French people who had deeply sympathized with Britain's decision to fight on, who had admired British courage, now felt utterly betrayed. The British had killed French sailors, had murdered French boys. Former trusted allies had become killers. A grieving woman in Bordeaux, whose young cousin had died in the attack at Mers el-Kébir, wrote in her diary with raw pain, "I genuinely wanted to believe the English were still our true friends, that they would eventually liberate us from German occupation someday, but now I know the truth. They're just as much our enemy as the Germans are. They've murdered our boys in cold blood." Vichy propaganda seized this moment eagerly. Posters went up across France, showing British warships firing on defenseless French sailors. Newspapers ran dramatic headlines about British treachery and betrayal. Marshal Pétain himself delivered speeches denouncing this hateful aggression by perfidious Britain. For several weeks after Mers el-Kébir, French public opinion swung sharply and dramatically against Britain. Even secret resistors, even those French men and women who privately hated the Vichy government, struggled emotionally with what Britain had done. A young man in Paris, who would later risk his life joining the resistance, wrote years afterward in his memoirs, "Mers el-Kébir made me hate the English deeply for months. I understood intellectually why they felt they had to do it strategically and militarily. But understanding their reasons didn't stop me from feeling hatred." But here's what's remarkable about human nature and the evolution of public opinion. The hatred didn't last forever for everyone. As summer slowly turned to fall, as the Battle of Britain raged dramatically in the skies over southern England, something important shifted in how people saw the situation. German bomber planes crossed the English Channel every single day in massive formations. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was supposed to crush British resistance in just a few weeks. Vichy-controlled newspapers confidently predicted imminent British surrender. German propaganda newsreels shown in French cinemas displayed burning British cities and claimed total victory was days away. The invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was supposedly coming any day now. But Britain stubbornly didn't surrender. The Royal Air Force fought back fiercely against overwhelming odds. German losses steadily mounted. Weeks passed, then entire months, and Britain was somehow still there. Still fighting, still defiant, still refusing to give up. French civilians noticed this unexpected resilience. In occupied Paris, a baker named Henri Dubois listened carefully to BBC broadcasts on a hidden radio he kept concealed. He heard detailed reports of RAF victories, of German bombers shot down in flames. He didn't know for certain if these reports were true or just clever propaganda, if the British were exaggerating or lying about their success. But he noticed something telling. The Germans seemed genuinely worried. The invasion that was supposed to happen in August, then supposedly in September, simply never came. Maybe, he whispered carefully to his wife in their bedroom late at night, maybe the English aren't as finished and defeated as we all thought they were. In the southern Vichy zone, a farmer went to see German newsreels at the local cinema. The propaganda films showed British cities burning from German bombs, but they also inadvertently showed something else. They showed British people absolutely refusing to give up hope. They showed Churchill giving defiant speeches. The farmer, who had genuinely thought Britain's decision to fight on was suicidal stupidity, started to wonder if perhaps he'd been wrong. By winter of 1940, stretching into 1941, French public opinion was shifting yet again, evolving in complex ways. Not everywhere, certainly not for everyone, but in certain social circles, in certain individual hearts, Britain's unlikely survival was fundamentally changing how people calculated the future. A young woman in Lyon named Lucy Aubrac, who would eventually become a famous and heroic resistance leader, wrote later about this crucial period in her memoirs, when Britain didn't fall as everyone predicted, when they somehow survived the sustained bombing, when they kept fighting month after month after month. It changed something deep inside us French people. It made active resistance seem actually possible rather than suicidal. If they could stand completely alone against the massive power of Germany, maybe we didn't have to passively accept defeat either. The class divisions persisted, but began to evolve in interesting ways. The bourgeoisie, who had strongly supported Vichy collaboration, started to carefully hedge their bets. Maybe Britain really would survive after all. Maybe Germany wouldn't actually win this war. Better to be very careful what you said publicly, just in case the future turned out differently than expected. A businessman in Toulouse, who had loudly praised Pétain's wisdom in making peace with Germany, started quietly telling people he had always privately thought Britain would probably hold out somehow. Among workers, among the political left, Britain's remarkable survival actively fueled growing organized resistance. Communist workers in Paris, despite the awkward fact that the Nazi-Soviet pact was still officially in effect, saw Britain's fight as living proof that fascism could actually be successfully opposed. Socialist workers in Marseille started secretly organizing resistance cells. Britain's example gave them genuine courage to act. But the regional divide between occupied and unoccupied France deepened significantly. In the occupied northern zone, German control was absolutely total and brutally enforced. Supporting Britain, even privately in your own home, was genuinely dangerous to your life. The Gestapo secret police and French collaborationist police forces arrested anyone even suspected of listening to BBC broadcasts, of spreading Gaullist propaganda supporting Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement, of expressing any hope for British victory. A simple woman in Lille was arrested merely for saying out loud that she hoped Britain would eventually win. She spent 6 long months in prison for those few words. In the unoccupied southern zone under Vichy, there was at least somewhat more breathing room to think freely, to talk carefully with trusted friends, to privately hope for a different future. The Vichy government still officially opposed Britain and supported Germany, but they couldn't possibly control every private conversation in every home. In living rooms, in quiet moments away from listening ears, people discussed what Britain's continued survival might actually mean for France's future. A brave teacher in Montpellier asked his students to write essays about the war as a class assignment. One student, just 14 years old, wrote something that could have gotten them all in serious trouble. Marshal Pétain tells us we must accept our defeat with dignity, but the English are showing us that defeat can simply be refused. I honestly don't know who is right, but I know which approach makes me feel less deeply ashamed of being French." The teacher carefully kept that essay hidden. He didn't turn it in to the school authorities as he was supposed to. He was slowly starting to think that perhaps the boy might be on to something important. By 1941, by 1942, as Britain not only survived but actually started to fight back more aggressively, as the war expanded dramatically to include the Soviet Union and then America, French civilian opinion continued its complex evolution. Those who had initially seen Britain's fight-on decision as foolish, stubbornness now saw it as strategic wisdom and vision. Those who had been angry at British abandonment at Dunkirk now desperately hoped for British liberation. Those who had supported Vichy's collaboration policy now quietly distanced themselves from it. But human nature and history are never simple or clean. A woman in Paris whose beloved brother had died at Mers el-Kabir never forgave Britain for that attack, not even after France's liberation. A man in Bordeaux who had praised British courage back in 1940 became an active collaborator with Germans in 1942, deciding that Germany would definitely win after all. A single family in Normandy split apart tragically, father firmly supporting Vichy, two sons joining the resistance inspired by British example, daughter marrying a German officer. The remarkable diversity of French opinion, the genuine complexity of French responses, reveals something deeply profound about what defeat and hope really mean. When France surrendered and Britain defiantly fought on, French civilians didn't react as one unified voice. They reacted as millions of individual human beings, each carrying their own fears, their own hopes, their own calculations about survival and dignity, and what the unknowable future might possibly hold. Some saw British defiance as truly noble. Some saw it as dangerously foolish. Some somehow saw it as both things at once. Some people changed their minds dramatically over time. Some stubbornly never did. A man in Toulouse, who had been captured during the fighting and then released, wrote to his sister in 1943, "When we surrendered, and the English kept fighting, I honestly thought they were complete idiots. I thought they'd be invaded within weeks, and we'd all be living under German rule anyway. So what was the point of more death and suffering? But they weren't invaded. They kept fighting when everyone said they'd lose. And now I'm in the resistance. I risk my life every day. The English were right all along. Some things are genuinely worth fighting for, even when you've already lost." But his sister wrote back with a different perspective that was equally valid. "You say the English were right, but how many more French people died because they kept fighting? How many more cities were bombed to rubble? How many more families were destroyed? Maybe if everyone had just made peace back in 1940, we'd all still be alive and whole. Maybe the English just prolonged everyone's suffering." Both of these letters survive today in historical archives. Both perspectives are real and deeply felt. Neither is complete without honestly considering the other. The story of what French civilians said when Britain fought on while France surrendered isn't a simple story of one unified reaction. It's a complex story of millions of different reactions constantly changing over time, shaped by social class and geographic region, and political beliefs and personal experience, and hope and fear and anger and admiration, all mixed together in complicated ways. In occupied Paris, one brave woman hid a British pilot who had been shot down over France. She risked her own life and her family's lives to help him escape. When asked years later why she had taken such a terrible risk, she said something simple and powerful. "Because when we French gave up, the British didn't. Someone had to remember that fighting back was still possible." In that same city, just a few streets away, another woman reported her neighbor to the authorities for secretly listening to BBC broadcasts. She genuinely believed in Pétain's vision of a new France at peace with Germany. She thought the British were unnecessarily prolonging the war. She wasn't a monster or evil. She was just a woman trying to survive and believing the authorities who told her that collaboration was the path to peace and stability. In the southern zone, a mayor of a small village courageously refused to implement Vichy's cruel anti-Jewish laws. When asked why he was taking such a risk, he said something that revealed his thinking. The English are still fighting. That means this isn't over. That means we don't have to obey these evil orders. He personally saved 17 Jewish families from deportation and death. In the very next village, another mayor enthusiastically implemented exactly the same anti-Jewish laws. He genuinely believed Vichy represented France's future. He thought Britain's continued fighting was just a British problem, not a French one. He saw absolutely no connection between British defiance far away and his own moral choices right in front of him. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared to invade France, as the resistance movement grew stronger and bolder, as Vichy's authority crumbled, French public opinion had shifted dramatically. Most French civilians now desperately hoped for Allied liberation. Most now saw Britain's fight-on decision as having been absolutely correct. But this was hindsight speaking. This was the view from victory, looking backward. Back in June 1940, standing in the ruins of total defeat, watching their country surrender while their ally fought on, French civilians had absolutely no way to know how it would eventually end. They had to make sense of an impossible situation with only the information they had at that moment, with their fears and hopes and exhaustion and anger and everything else that makes us human. Some French civilians saw British defiance and felt abandoned. Some saw it and felt hope. Some felt both contradictory feelings at once. Some changed their minds, some never did. All of them were French. All of them were trying to survive. All of them were responding to an impossible situation with whatever resources they had. An old woman in Provence asked in 1945 what she had thought when Britain fought on while France surrendered, said something that captured the confusion perfectly. "I thought they were crazy. I thought they'd be destroyed quickly. I thought we'd all be destroyed. But I also thought, somewhere deep down, that maybe crazy was exactly what the moment required. Maybe sanity was surrender, and madness was hope. And maybe, just maybe, we needed more madness." She paused, looking at the interviewer. "I was right. We needed the madness. We needed someone to refuse the logic of defeat. Even if it was the English. Even if they'd left us at Dunkirk. Even if they'd killed our sailors at Mers el-Kebir. We needed someone to show us that saying no was still possible. But then," she added thoughtfully, "I didn't know that in 1940. In 1940, I just thought they were crazy." That uncertainty, that not knowing, that living through history without knowing how it ends, that was the reality for French civilians in the summer of 1940. They didn't know Britain would survive. They didn't know America would join the war. They didn't know they'd be liberated. They only knew their country had surrendered, and their ally hadn't. And they had to decide what that meant. Their answers varied enormously because they were human. Because humans are complex. Because defeat and hope and fear and courage don't follow simple patterns. Some French civilians praised British determination. Some cursed it. Some did both. Some changed their minds over time. Some never did. What they said when Britain fought on while France surrendered was everything. It was anger and admiration. It was despair and hope. It was betrayal and inspiration. It was all of it at once. Millions of voices responding to an impossible moment in millions of different ways. And that complexity, that refusal to fit into a simple narrative, that's what makes their responses so human, so real, so worth remembering today.